Today we are looking at section 2.4 part 2. We just spent some time doing some long division. Now we're going to use synthetic division. Synthetic division is going to make it a little simpler once you get the setup. It's pretty easy to do. You no longer have the variable raised to powers. You're just going to have some numbers that you're going to use to go through a process. So we have these 7 steps, very similar to how the long division was, a lot of words, a lot of unknowns until you actually get into doing them. So I'm going to read through them, explain a couple of things as we go, but you're really going to understand it once we get to an example. So step 1 says we're going to arrange a polynomial in descending powers with a 0 coefficient for any missing terms, so highest power to lowest power. It then says to write C for the divisor x minus C. What does that mean? If I had something like an x minus 2, that C value is what's ever after the minus sign, which means that we would end up using 2 as our divisor. So our divisor in a case of an x minus 2 would be a 2. Another way to figure that out, instead of looking after the subtraction sign, would be to take that thing and set it equal to 0 and then solve for what x is equal to. X equals 2 means that that would be like a solution or a 0 of a polynomial expression. So it says to write C for the divisor. So we're going to pick that number, just the number 2 in our case of an x minus 2. So just the value C, the number after the minus sign, to divide by. So we're going to write C for the divisor. To the right, write the coefficients of the dividend. So once we kind of set things up, what we would end up doing is we would have just the coefficients, just the numerical values. So if you had something like a 2x squared plus a 3x minus 5, you're going to look at just the coefficients. You're going to look at a 2, you're going to look at a 3, and you're going to look at a negative 5. Step 3 says to write the leading coefficient of the dividend on the bottom row. We'll look at what that means in a moment. Step 4 says to multiply C times the value just written on the bottom row and write the product in the next column in the second row. Again, I'm just going to read through these and we'll look at it through the example. Step number 5 says to add the values in this new column, writing the sum on the bottom row, and then we repeat this series of multiplications and added-ins until all columns are filled in. And step 7 says to use the numbers in the last row to write the quotient plus the remainder above the divisor. The degree of the first term of the quotient is 1 less than the degree of the first term of the dividend. Anytime you're dividing, you're always going to end up with 1 less power. So if you had an x to the second power as your number you were dividing, the greatest answer would have an x to the first power. If you had an x to the fifth power, your answer would only have at most x to the fourth power. It says that the final value in this row is the remainder. So let's take a look at what that means. As I said, sometimes it just makes so much more sense when we look at it as an example. So it says to use synthetic division to divide x to the third minus 7x minus 6 by x plus 2. So it says that the divisor must be in the form x minus c. So if I have an x plus 2, that means I really have an x minus a negative 2, right? I mentioned look after the minus sign, which means our c value in this case is going to be a negative 2. It says writing 0 coefficient for the missing x squared term, because notice we have an x to the third and we have x to the first. That means we also have a 0x to the second, so we're going to use a 0 in place of that term. It says we can express the division as follows. So technically we have an x minus a negative 2 that's dividing into an x to the third plus a 0x squared minus a 7x minus 6. It says now we're ready to perform the synthetic division. So we are going to take and we are going to set it up where this negative 2, the piece that we're dividing by, is going to go in this little kind of like L shape over on the side here. And then we're going to take a look at our coefficients. Well, this is an x to the third, which means I have a 1. We have a 0. We have a negative 7. We have a negative 6. Those are all the coefficients of those x values. See where we have a 1, a 0, a negative 7, and a negative 6? Now from here, what they said is you're going to take and you are going to drop this first thing down. That's where that step says, let me go back up here real quick. It says to write the leading coefficient of the dividend on the bottom row. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to take that first value that we have and we are just going to drop it down and call it a 1. And then what we're going to do Sorry, I have to scroll back up again. It says then we're going to multiply C times the value just written on that bottom row. So what we're going to do is we are going to take this 1 that's at the bottom here. We're going to multiply it by a -2. So 1 times a -2 is going to give us a -2. That is going to go right underneath of this 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add 0 with -2, which is going to give us a -2. And then we're going to do our multiplication again. -2 is going to multiply by -2, which gives us a +4. So I'm going to write a +4 underneath of that -7. I'm going to add them together. -7 plus 4 would leave us with a -3. And I'm going to do that again. -3 is going to multiply by my -2, which gives me a +6. And what am I left with? I'm left with 0. Now this last value here, that 0, is what we have as our remainder. And so they want to know, what is the quotient? Well, as I did that division, I am left with a 1, a -2, and a -3. And if we go back up here and take a look, once we repeated that series of multiplications and added-ins until all columns are filled in, use the numbers in the last row to write the quotient plus the remainder above the divisor. Above the divisor, that means as that fraction, right? The remainder above the divisor, that was that final fraction you'd have, that remainder, right? It says the degree of the first term of the quotient is 1 less than the degree of the first term of the dividend. So that means when I come back down here, our highest power was a third power. So if I divide down a third power, what's the next power down? Well, the next power down is going to be a second power. So that means this 1 is going to be the x to the second. This is going to be the plain x, and then this is going to be that constant value, which means the answer to our quotient is we had 1 with the x squared, so we're going to have x squared. We have a -2 with x, so we're going to put a -2x. And then all we have is a plain constant value, -3. Since we have a remainder of 0, I do not need to write +0 divided by that x plus 2. That was what we originally divided by up here. I don't need this piece in here, but if I had a remainder, I would have to show that. So I'm just going to erase it because it's not part of our final answer, right, since we have a 0 left over.